Welcome to the Tribe of the Restored Warrior podcast, where coming home changed doesn't mean you're broken.
Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Justin Wright, United States Marine Corps Combat Veteran and social worker for veterans and first responders. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Ben Iobst, United States Army Combat Veteran, retired police officer, and doctor in psychology. All right, so we're going to get into talking about transitioning after service. So, talk to me about your experience. What do you think where some men and women fall short?
So, we have to look at this from a couple different perspectives. I would say, we have our active duty folks who are away at war, away from society, and then returning home. It's usually for prolonged periods of time. Then we have our Reserve and National Guard folks, and those individuals will do that multiple times, but it might be shorter stints. Mm-hmm. And then we have our first responders, and our first responders they're basically doing small deployments every day, multiple days in a week, and, returning home. And within that, there's a lot of different pieces that really come into play. So you're completely in a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
The military is a entirely different culture. And then the first responder world, you're going to all, nobody calls 911 because they're having a good day.
Right.
So you're constantly seeing these bad things. And then you pop back out of it, right? Whether it be after a multiple month deployment, a year-long deployment, 18-month deployment, or a shift for a first responder. And somehow we're supposed to turn that off. We're supposed to turn off everything that we just saw and experienced.
Mm.
And that's difficult. That's not within human nature. So really diving into that and telling people, one, it's okay to not be okay with that. That's really, really important to begin that discussion of this isn't how most other people experience life. But we're built that way. We're the type of people on the military side, on the first responder side, that run towards danger. And while that makes us really, really good at the work that we do, it makes us ignore a lot of red flags within our personal lives.
So it sounds like a little bit of the difference is, military service, you're gone 6, maybe a year on a deployment, where first responders, they're kind of experiencing these things and kind of like, correct me if this doesn't sound right, but microdosing throughout a shift of these same type of experiences, maybe even a little bit more intense, more frequently.
Yeah, I would say that's accurate. On the military side, you're really removed from your home culture and deployed to a different country, and the experiences of war are very, very intense, but they're intense in a combat way. And what I mean by that is there's a bit of an expectation there.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make it any less traumatic, but there's an expectation that I'm going to see bad things. I'm in a war zone, and this shock to the conscience, when we expect that something is coming, sometimes it doesn't shock our conscience as much. So in a war zone, the really, really bad stuff usually shocks the conscience. So your car bomb, multiple casualties, injuries of your teammates, deaths of your teammates, injuries and deaths to civilians and children. Those are the giant shockers. Whereas on the first responder side, we expect there to be a level of safety. We're raised, insulated in the United States of America. We have a very safe culture. Contrary to what we hear constantly on the news, we have a very safe culture compared to other countries. And when we are exposed to these incidents, a child death, and what worse is some of these things are child deaths at the hands of the parents, heinous domestics, all these things that are in our backyard, that has a bit of a different effect on the psyche because it's right next door now. And you also don't necessarily expect it. So in the first responder world, you're expected to maintain order. But when you first get into this line of work, your understanding of what maintaining order and providing safety to people is based off of your upbringing. And now you're going into some very, very volatile situations of people who didn't come up that way. There may be drugs involved, severe mental illness involved, a lot of violence, and you're being shocked. So you're coming out of whatever your background is, and now you're being exposed to this horrible situation, which could be, abuse of a child, sexual abuse of a child, murder of a child, seeing a really bad domestic homicide, a heinous car accident where, people are dismembered. Those things shock down to the core because it's the unexpected. And as time goes on, the first responder does generally grow to accept that they're going to see those things. But the military deployment is a year long, and then there's a break. The first responder world, it's every day for 20 years. So the effects are very similar in a lot of ways, but the distrust that comes from that is probably more pronounced in the first responder. You're seeing it right in your backyard. Does that make sense?
It does. So you basically what you're saying is there's no time for decompression really because you're in it.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. So what do you think? When it comes to resiliency and wellness, especially with first responders, what do you think the big thing is missing?
So the military, believe it or not, does do a better job than the first responder world with a lot of its resiliency programs. While the VA may not be amazing, it's something. Whereas the first responder, there is not a lot there. So that conversation is important to begin having first responder. That we have to normalize the trauma and the struggle that these guys are having so that they begin to talk about it. When we look at the veteran, the average veteran's life expectancy is about 10 years less than the regular population. The first responder's life expectancy is 21 years less. I truly believe that comes from a lack of acceptance within the first responder and within the community that these guys and girls are going to go out there and experience these traumas. And society kind of expects that these are all going to be taken care of quietly. We don't have to hear about them later. And they almost don't want to believe that all these things are going on. So society kind of ignores the plight of the first responder, and the first responder is trained to ignore their own plight, their own trauma. Whereas in the military world, there has been a lot of advancement within the understanding of PTSD. Again, the traumas are there for the military individuals, but there's also a level of understanding that those traumas are there, and there's some support there. Whereas in the first responder world, that discussion is only beginning. A good example is there's been 5 decades of study of military PTSD, but in the state of Pennsylvania, here where we're at, they just began acknowledging that PTSD exists in the first responder world, which is pretty shocking, in my opinion, that we hadn't looked at this in the past.
That is pretty surprising. I mean, what do you think? Where was the resistance with that?
I would say it was, really a matter of probably a couple different things. The culture that existed before. There was kind of a, we'll handle this and don't worry about what's going on type of mentality from the first responder world. There was this desire to do our duty and silently take care of everything. And that was kind of accepted by society too. If you look at a lot of the movements that have happened, that fund the police movement, all these things, it's really putting a microscope on the world of first responders, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in the capacity that there is now attention being paid to the mental wellness of first responders.
Mm-hmm.
Did it generalize a lot of first responders? Absolutely. It said, oh, we're all out there screwed up and abusing people. That is not the case in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, the profession of first responders generally has far less of a disciplinary issue than most other professions. But the attention being paid there is also bringing to light that there is a trauma issue within the first responder community that is very similar to the military community. And it mirrors a lot of the same things. So a lot of the same services and supports are very effective to help in those capacities also.
So when it comes to first responders, I mean, we kind of touched on it with military veterans and a little bit of first responders in the beginning, but the transition, right, leaving service.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that and what maybe were some of the hurdles that some of the listeners could maybe take some tips?
I would say accept that normal is not something that exists. Normal is something that only exists on your washing machine. And when an individual goes off to war, or even deployments, some of these deployments that people are going to, Hurricane Katrina, Haiti, you're seeing some really shocking stuff. And that is going to change an individual and establish basically a new normal in them. And that doesn't make you broken. It doesn't make you broken. That just makes you changed from what you used to be. But everybody changed. We changed throughout our life. And there is, in a traumatic situation, there's an accelerated change. But as a community of veterans and first responders, we accept each other and the fact that there is going to be a change.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to take that change and view it from a positive perspective. And if there are underlying issues, if there are trauma-related issues, if the person has begun to self-medicate with drugs or alcohol, we help that individual. We help that individual through compassionate accountability. Not saying, hey, listen, it's okay that you're drinking and doing crazy things or doing drugs and stealing from your family. We don't tell them that, but we say, hey, we recognize it. You're struggling, and we want to help. And make sure that the resources that are in place are actually effective. There's a lot of resources that have been talked about, put out over the years that maybe aren't culturally competent for first responders and veterans, meaning they just don't have the right people involved. Mm-hmm. Anytime that you're dealing with any segment of society, and especially a segment of society that's struggling, they're hypersensitive. So you need to make sure that therapists, social workers, and all the resources that are involved are culturally competent, meaning they have an understanding and empathy for the culture that they're treating. And in the first responder world and the military world, that is essential because these individuals, the traumatized first responder and the traumatized veteran, are extremely suspicious individuals. So making sure there's cultural competence is essential because a lot of times you are only going to get one shot with this individual to gain credibility.
You give me an example, cultural competency compared to military or first responders. Like, give me two.
So one of the first questions I generally will ask, so we vet out a lot of therapists and things like that. And, when we are checking to see if a therapist is going to be effective within the first responder and veteran community, one of the first questions that we actually ask are, would you feel comfortable if you were a client has a concealed weapons permit or as a police officer that's off duty and they are actively carrying a firearm concealed on their person while you're having an appointment with them? And if they say no, that makes me extremely uncomfortable. That's a problem. That's a problem. Now, I'm not saying that if we have someone that's in extreme crisis, right, and they're heavily intoxicated, or they're, in psychosis, we don't want that individual to actively be carrying a firearm.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have the officer or the veteran that's struggling with just general anxiety, and they're seeing a psychologist, and that psychologist is saying, I don't want you to have your firearm on you, that is a problem because we are now basically disarming a warrior, which is one of the largest, I would say, and most robust forms of disrespect, is disarming a warrior and saying, you no longer can carry your weapon because I don't believe that you're safe. Now, in some situations, is that true? Yeah, we talked about that. When there's a series of very, very dangerous things out there, and we've got to help that veteran or first responder out by protecting them from themselves for a while.
Mhm.
But your guy that's really working on himself and just trying to really refine, telling him, no, I don't want you to have your firearm on you, or no, you can't carry a pocket knife into this session, generally will tell me that we have someone that's probably not culturally out to first responder.
So I'd like to talk a little bit more about maybe some resiliency, and especially your specialty in psychology and how that applies to this.
Absolutely. So within the veteran and first responder community, one of the most important things that we have to begin to do is normalize what we're experiencing. We're not broken. And getting with other individuals who are dealing with similar things in a healthy way is absolutely essential. I've heard it stated a lot, a tribe. And that, in my opinion, is one of the most important pieces in developing resiliency as a veteran and a first responder. Getting around a healthy tribe of individuals. It doesn't have to be huge. It could be a couple people within your life. Struggle Well talks about this. 3 to 5 people in your life that are positive motivators. And we are what we practice. So if we're practicing the positive stuff, we're going to get better at being positive. So getting around 3 to 5 people, texting 3 to 5 people that are positive, keeping them active in your life, you're active in their life, really, really helps a lot with that. And what that does is that then allows us to have a support structure. And a support structure is absolutely key. Because if you think about it from the military, you think about it from the first responder world, we don't do anything by ourselves. Everything involves a team.
This is Justin. Thanks for listening to the Tribe of the Restored Warriors podcast. Tribe of the Restored Warrior works in collaboration and contributes to Vets and Badges, where real-life heroes share their trials and tribulations. Please check out www.vetsandbadges.com for more information.